All right, welcome back to the My Sugar Free Journey podcast. We are joined today by Dr. Joe Kosterich. So, Dr. Joe is a doctor, a speaker, an author, a media presenter, a health industry consultant. He has written for numerous medical and mainstream publications. He's also a regular on radio and television. He's often called to give medical opinions on medical legal cases. He's also an adjunct professor at UWA. He's a supporting clinical editor of Medical Forum magazine and an advisor to read at medical conferences. He's a man with a finger in a lot of pies. He's also a medical advisor to a medicinal cannabis company. I think we're going to touch on that a little bit. He sits on the board of Australian Tobacco Harm Reduction Association. Fantastic a man with a wealth of knowledge. He's got 2 self-published books. We'll talk about that at the end. And he continues to practice as a GP each week. So, Dr. Joe Kosterich, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm lovely to be with you.
Thank you so much. So, how did you decide, or why did you decide to be a doctor? What was your path like? What brought you to this point?
Yeah, look, obviously it's a few years ago now. Look, I suppose I was fairly fortunate to do okay in high school, and then you're sort of left with a bit of a quandary as to which path to go down. And my mother, as is sometimes the case, sort of influenced me a bit and said, look, really you should study medicine. Family sort of background is her mother had wanted her to study medicine, but she never did. And indeed, my grandmother had started studying medicine, and this was, in the 1920s or so, and had given it away. So I didn't have a particularly, burning, I suppose, to be honest, desire one way or the other. So in the toss-up, I suppose medicine appealed more than law, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Fantastic. Well, I know from doing the show for a long time now that if you've studied to be a doctor, you've been trained to do things that I would consider the wrong way. So I'm always fascinated to talk to low-carb doctors because it means that you've made a couple transitions. You've made probably the biggest one being that you can tackle how a lot of diseases harm your patients with lifestyle interventions instead of, pills or whatever. Plus, you've also made the transition that steak and red meat is not the most terrible thing in the world, and maybe that sugar is. So that part of the story always interests me. How did you make those transitions and start to see things in a new light, and then maybe how you were trained?
Look, really good point. And it's funny because I was having a chat with a colleague this morning about how, as doctors compared to engineers, we tend to be a little bit less inclined to want to solve problems and tend to more just accept what we're told by professors and those who are deemed to be sort of superior in inverted commas to us. So medicine is a little bit hierarchical in that regard. I first became interested in, I suppose, in looking at things a different way about 14, 15 years ago. There were a couple of American visiting lecturers who were at a conference that I attended, and they were talking at that time about anti-aging medicine. And a lot of what they were talking about was use of hormones, which, to be honest, I didn't particularly warm to, although I could see a role for it. But they really spoke a lot about lifestyle, and it just got me sort of thinking, and particularly when they're talking about sugar and the effects of sugar on the body. And it just got me thinking, well, if you go back to basic human physiology, then that dictates that when we put any glucose or carbohydrates into the body will release insulin, and the role of insulin is to convert that carbohydrate into fat and store it as such. So surely if we're telling people to eat a lot of this sort of food, maybe we shouldn't be surprised that the end result is people are storing a lot of it as fat. And probably over the years, as people do, you go down the rabbit hole, you read some papers, you talk to people, you attend conferences. It's a bit like being in the Matrix, and once you've sort of swallowed the red pill, it's sort of hard to unswallow it. And probably the last 5 years or so, I've in a few areas really become convinced that I have to be a little bit careful what I say, but I suppose in medicine we're not particularly well led. I think, by people who are rightly or wrongly seen as leaders of the profession. And you know, I can only speak, I suppose, for Australia, but when I look around the world, it seems very similar in the US and the UK and other countries. There seems to be this very hierarchical top-down view. You do what we tell you and you don't question it, and if you do, we'll have a crack at you. And if they're all doing everything correct, look, you know, maybe fine. But when you actually seriously question a lot of the received wisdom that doctors and the public are supposed to accept, you actually find that it doesn't have much basis. Yeah, I suppose once you've seen that, you can't unsee it.
Well, from my experience, and again, you know, I'm not a doctor, but I've talked to a lot of doctors on this podcast, and the story that I keep getting is, in America, if a doctor wants to be low carb, he pretty much gets left alone. There hasn't been a doctor that has been called on the carpet or had their medical license threatened because they've advised their patients to go low carb. But you know, we've had a very high profile case in South Africa. We've had a very high profile case in New Zealand, right next to you, with Gary Fettke.
Well, actually, Gary Fettke is Australian.
Oh, I thought he was New Zealand.
Like, he's from Tasmania, which is the southern island of Australia. But I
thought that was the. I'm American. I don't know anything about geography. I thought it was.
Be careful what I say, but no, Tasmania is part of Australia. It's close to New Zealand. In fact, where I am on the west coast of Australia, Tasmania is a lot closer to New Zealand than it is to me. But I know it is actually part of Australia.
So I thought it was a separate board. So there's already been a high profile case there in Australia of a doctor that has been called on the carpet for being low carb. Since you guys are under that same board, has there been any kind of a change in attitude now that Gary Fettke has gone through all of this? Have you felt like maybe a little bit of the pressure is off, or do you really think that they're still kind of looking for a sacrificial goat for this?
Look, Gary's case, which went for 4.5 years in the beginning, is finally getting this case completely quashed, and something unprecedented, which was an apology from the medical regulator. Yeah. Also this year, we've had the Dietitians Association president, who was involved with the part of the original complaint, step down. And we've also had the Dietitians Association just in the last couple of months very quietly say they're going to end their corporate partnership arrangements with some of the manufacturers of processed foods. There's been set up a group called Australian and New Zealand Doctors Talk Paleo, Keto and Low Carb. That's a Facebook group, and it's up to about 1,600 members. So I suppose to get back to your question, now that the whole finding has been overturned, I think there is a view that the regulator in Australia will not try again to take on doctors over dietary advice. So I think some people are still a little bit wary, but the fact that he was fully exonerated and received an apology, and the people who have complained are now sort of running a little bit for cover, suggests that you know, we are seeing, I think we will see more doctors being prepared to recommend low carb, and I think the regulators will have to, again, you know, I think they will have to stay away. I don't think they've got really any grounds to go doctors on that basis. But sometimes these people are a bit of a law unto themselves. But it's certainly looking a lot better than it was 12 months ago.
Well, good. I hope that we can that things can progress and there can be a thawing of the of the the relationships between the rank and file doctors that are trying new things, and the people that are higher up that are kind of stuck in the old way of thinking. The old saying about science progressing one funeral at a time. And sometimes you listen to how these people are talking, you think, okay, well, it's going to be 20 years before we get rid of this person. And then, maybe the next person's got some more up-to-date information. So let's leave that behind. Let's talk about your practice specifically. So you've got a new patient, and let's say you got a patient that's who I was 5 years ago, 400 pounds, crazy high blood pressure. I had metabolic syndrome. I had a lot of things going wrong with me, asthma, things like this. What's that process look like for you? How are you onboarding them? How are you counseling them? And then how are you walking them through the steps of making, lasting lifestyle changes?
Yeah, look, and I suppose each approach is a little bit different to each individual person. It very, very much depends on, and you give an example there, on where the person is at, what they've tried before, what their conditions are, what their medications are, and I suppose where they're at in their life. So I think the beginnings of it is, well, how have you arrived at this point? I mean, we have to go back a little bit and get a little bit of background as to, how they reached this point. What have they been doing? Was there a time when some of these conditions, wasn't something that they had? Have they accumulated different medications over the years? What sort of things have they done that has tried and not worked? And obviously that leads into one of the things that I always ask people to do is keep a food diary for a week. And I do stress that it's not an exam. There is no right or wrong answer. In some respects, the worse it is, almost the better, because it gives us more ground, more opportunity to make change. If people are in a bad way and they're doing everything right, it's a little bit harder. And then I'm a very, very firm believer in trying to keep things fairly simple. And I think sometimes diet, and that's whether it's the standard in inverted commas diet or a low carb diet, can be made harder than it needs to be. And people think, what am I going to have for lunch on Tuesday? And, what if I eat something that's wrong? And I think it's about emphasizing to people that, number one, it's not a religion. Number two, that low carb is not the same as no carb. So if it's Sunday and you want to go out for breakfast and you want to have a slice of toast, you know what? The world's not going to stop spinning. So don't feel that, you can never have anything that's got some carbs in it. However, if we want to make some change, then we have to go back to the 80-20 principle. And certainly at the start, people are eating a lot of breakfast cereals, if they're eating, a lot of bread, rice, pasta, snack foods, all those sorts of foods, then that is what's going to need to change. And then people say, well, what does that leave me with? Well, the answer to that is pretty much what your grandparents probably ate, which is meat, fish, chicken, or other forms of protein, vegetables, maybe a little bit of fruit, not that much, because yes, there is sugar in fruit, and some nuts and seeds, and drink mainly water. And that's the basics. Yeah. That is the basics. And, whether you want to have steak or whether you want to have lamb chops or whether you want to have salmon, it doesn't really matter. And it is also important for people, if they are overweight, that, portion size still does have a role. It's a lot easier when you're low carb, but you know what? If you eat 5 kilos of steak, it's still probably a bit more than you should be eating. So, it sounds silly when you put it like that, but it is about, with each person, understanding where they're at. And also, it's no point telling people to eat foods that they don't like. So you have to sort of work with the individual and say, well, what can we arrive at that is going to work for you? And that ultimately is not, and this is a really important point, not about being on a diet, but about changing your eating patterns, not just for the next 3 or 6 weeks or months, but hopefully for the rest of your life.
The 80-20 principle is argued about, I think, quite a bit, because you have some people that can do that can, they'll eat a piece of bread once a week and, be just fine. And then you have other people that are very much like addicts, that if they eat a piece of bread, it sends them into the spiral where they're eating, an entire loaf a day, and you're undoing a lot of the work that you did before. Have you run into that? Do you see that is something that you see with your clients?
Look, everybody is different, and clearly what works for one person doesn't for the others. I think at the start, when making changes, there's 2 approaches. One is just basically wholesale changes. Just from day one, you just got to cut out pretty much everything you're doing and start from scratch. Mm-hmm. Equally, I had somebody come to see me literally last week, who said, look, she'd gone on to and she'd not seen me before, she was seeing another doctor, had gone on to a ketogenic type of diet and said, look, I've been doing this now for 3 months. The first 2 months, I wanted to ease myself into it. And the last month, I've been, pretty strict and full on. And that's the other way of going. So, I don't believe one wants to be too, prescriptive in this. And some people are a little bit, more or less carb sensitive, and some of that revolves around their insulin sensitivity. So some people, if their insulin systems are still pretty good, look, they may well have some carbs and it won't affect them too much. Other people are going to be very, very, very sensitive. And for some people, it is also that psychological thing that if I have one piece, I might as well have 20 pieces. So this is, finding out what works for people. But I think it is so important. It is so important that this is with anything you're doing in your health or with your life, if you're on a program and you drift a bit off the rails, then you can always get back on the rails. If Sunday things didn't go your way, Monday's another day. And I think sometimes when people, stub their toes or trip up or do the wrong, in inverted commas, thing, and they, oh, look, I might as well give it all away now. No, whatever you did yesterday, fine, reset for today, and away we go again. I think that's really important.
So let's talk about the time restraints that you have as a doctor, because this is a big issue, and I think it's one of the reasons why doctors are more prone to, you've got a patient come in, and you could do one of two things. You could sit down with them and try to get them to change everything that's bad about their life, or you could fill out a prescription and give them the prescription, get them out the door, and go on to the next one and see a patient every 5 to 7 minutes, which appears to be the average here in the States. And so the counseling time, the amount of time that it takes to really kind of get across to someone what they're doing. Are you doing that on an individual basis? Are you bringing your patients in for like a mass class? How are you handling the time issue when it comes to trying to get someone to go low carb in their diet?
Yeah. Look, I think there's to me, there's two aspects to that. Number one is not everything has to be achieved in a single visit. In fact, there's a lot to be said for, seeing people a few times over a period of a few weeks. And we know that if people attend a lecture or they go to a doctor, within a couple of weeks, they may well have forgotten a fair bit of what you said. So the more you try to load people up with lots of information in one sitting, I'm not sure that always is the way to go. I think doing it in stages is probably better, because you can reinforce some of the ideas at a second and then a third visit. And it doesn't have to be, the next week. It can be after a couple of weeks and then a month. Number two is, and this is something that I have medical students in, and I do say to them, it doesn't always have to take a long period of time to convey some basic concepts and principles. And this comes back to the idea of keeping it fairly simple. So to me, it's not about trying to work out an entire detailed program that says to people, right, we're going to work out what you're going to have for lunch on Tuesday and for dinner on Friday. No, that really is for the individual to do. I see my role as to say, these are the broad parameters within which we want to work. So these are the sorts of food groups you should be having. These are the sorts of portions maybe you should be thinking about. This is the sort of exercise you should be looking at. So we're really looking at setting broad parameters rather than, I'm not a micromanager. Now, other doctors will do things differently, and I don't think there's a right or a wrong, but I don't believe in micromanaging. I believe in saying to people, this is the direction, these are the broad brushstrokes, and there's lots and lots of resources. I mean, there's lots of resources. There are books, there are websites, there are programs. I personally, I don't entirely see that my role is to, with patients, to be the category killer. Part of my role is to also direct them, to other resources and information sites where they can, get some ideas from me and then go further in their own time. So yeah, I think that's one can work around these issues. There are ways around it.
Good. What about medications? So I know doctors that, not really, I guess functional doctors too, but doctors that are focused on lifestyle first. Sometimes it can be difficult when dealing with different medications because you're trying to get them off medications, but you want to make sure that they're well taken care of, especially in the transition time where they're trying to make these changes to their diet and to their lifestyle. What are some of the markers that you're looking for if you want to put them on a high blood pressure medication or a cholesterol medication or metformin, or some of these medications that you might need for a year or two or a little more before you really, undo some of the damage that you're doing to your body? What do you have criteria? What is it that you're trying to do there?
I seriously, I think the criteria for treatment, particularly with diabetes or with high blood pressure, are broadly the same as anybody else's. I mean, I may, I suppose, allow a little bit more leeway than some other doctors before starting medications. But, the overarching aim is not, the overarching aim is how can we get people to improve their health? And there's a number of ways that can be done. So it's not so much, in my opinion, about should we use medications or shouldn't we use medications. What we should be doing is saying, how can this person best improve their health? Now, in an ideal world, with 75% of the illness burden and chronic disease burden being related to lifestyle issues, then, hopefully at least 75% of the solution should be lifestyle. But, back in the real world, it isn't always like that. So I don't believe in cutting off one's nose, cutting off your nose to spite your face. If somebody's got very high blood pressure or their, diabetes markers are way out of control and there's not going to be some change happening in the next day or week, then that still needs to be treated and managed. We still need to do things to help that person, and they may well need medications. If their blood pressure is, just to pluck a number from the air, 200 over 100, and they're overweight, and yes, we want them to lose weight. We want to do lots of things to help that person do it. But you know what? Until that happens, they may still need some medication. And sometimes an incentive for people, or something you can say, well, here's something you can aspire to, is either reducing your dose of medication or coming off medication. Yeah. So if you say, well, what parameters or criteria would I use to use medications? It's the standard ones. If the markers are such that they need treatment, then they need treatment. Now, there could be short, medium, and long term. And I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I don't think we want to throw babies out with bathwater. Neither do we want to just be reflexly reaching for the prescription pad and ignoring all these other things that really we should be doing and arguably should be doing first.
How long have you been counseling patients to change lifestyle as opposed to kind of the older model to do that? How many years do you think you've been doing that?
That's a good question. I stop and think about it. Look, probably increasingly over the last 10, 15 or so.
Okay. And what are some of the results that you've seen?
Again, it does vary. And I think it also self-selects a little bit because, rightly or wrongly, there are people who would also prefer to take a tablet than perhaps make changes. But some of the results that you do see, can be quite dramatic. I've seen people lose, I was going to say 20, 30, 40 kilos. What's that? Sort of, 45, 50, 70 pounds, something like that over a period of, some, 3 to 6 to 9 months. So the diabetes markers, what's called the HbA1c, we can see those go from, 8 and 9 down back into normal readings, into normal levels, and people can come off their medications. I remember many years ago, this lady, I think she was in her upper 60s and really, rose to the challenge, if you like. And within a matter of 12 months, she'd come off, I think, 2 different, diabetes medications, and had dropped about, this is a while ago, and I'm trying to remember, probably, a good 70, 80 pound or so. And look, to be fair, there are others who just never seem to quite get there, but everybody's on their own pathway and journey, and sometimes people come back years later and say, look, I wasn't ready when we spoke about this before, but I'm ready now.
Good deal. Well, I'm also interested in a couple of other things that you are involved in. Number one is tobacco reduction, and you're actually an advocate for vaping. Can you talk about that a little bit? Why? My understanding of vaping is very limited. I've got one son that does it. Is there tobacco in vaping, and how is vaping less harmful for, say, your lungs, your overall health than smoking cigarettes?
Yeah. Look, in an ideal world, probably nobody would be smoking or vaping. Vaping doesn't have tobacco, and this is the key point, that people, and this was identified in the early 70s, that generally people smoke because they want the nicotine. Nicotine is a slightly psychoactive substance. It doesn't give them a high, but it either has a calming effect, or it has an effect on. It's one of the reasons why something like 80% of people with schizophrenia smoke. It's because the nicotine has a calming effect on them. So when you vape, you're getting nicotine without tar, without carbon monoxide, without a whole host of other noxious and carcinogenic chemicals that come from burning tobacco. So it's not nicotine that causes lung cancer. It's not nicotine that kills people. It's the burning of tobacco. So when you have liquid nicotine and you're vaping it, you're getting the nicotine without all those other chemicals. It's similar to people if they're using the chewing gums that people use to quit smoking, or the patches that have nicotine in them. So it's nicotine replacement. It is estimated by Public Health UK, it's a government agency, that vaping is at least 95% less harmful than smoking. So it's not harmless. Nothing on this planet is harmless. And if somebody doesn't smoke, I would absolutely not be advocating that they take up vaping.
Right.
But if somebody does smoke, then I would absolutely say that it is far better that they vape than they smoke.
Yeah, there's some controversy here in the States. The company Juul there's been some pressure put on them to not make flavored, what do you call them, vape pods or whatever.
Liquids. Yes, I know, which are sort of seen as being appealing to the youth market. Interestingly, adults like lollies as well. And the flavors appeal to adult smokers. It's not just the kids. And there has been a degree, because obviously I do follow these things, a degree of moral panic over Juul. But what the data still tells us is that smoking rates amongst American youth is still in decline. So if vaping was a gateway into smoking, we'd be seeing higher rates of youth smoking, and that's not what we're seeing. So should kids be taking it up? No. But if they have to take up something, I'd tell you what, I'd sooner them vape than smoke, and I'd sooner them vape than use heroin or a whole lot of other things. So, sometimes we have to be a bit pragmatic. And the other thing I think is worth saying is, for a lot of people also, they like a hand-mouth movement. And the nicotine gums, the nicotine sprays, and the nicotine patches don't provide that. So look, vaping is a practical, solution, and it does enable smokers to access nicotine in a less harmful way.
Yeah. So the other thing that you're involved in is marijuana advocacy. So this is something else that here in the States is, kind of a firestorm of debate is going over. But it seems like the pro-marijuana advocates are winning the debate, and we're seeing more and more states make it legal. And it's probably only a matter of time before it becomes legal at the federal level as well. You just got to get the right guy in office, I think. Why do you advocate for marijuana use, and what are some of the things that people should be concerned about?
Yeah. Now, I really want to very, very clearly separate medicinal cannabis from recreational marijuana use.
Okay.
And my involvement is with a medicinal cannabis company in Australia. In the US, I think you now have 32 states that have legalized medicinal cannabis. I think Missouri and I can't remember the second state that just came up at your most recent midterm elections. And I think there's about 8 or 9 that have recreational marijuana, and obviously Canada's gone down that path. Canada's had medicinal cannabis for about 18 years, and it's used in other jurisdictions.
In
Essentially,
Canada, now my understanding of Canada is it's totally legal across
it
the
is
board.
now, yes, they've gone legal recreational as of
Yeah.
October, but they've had medicinal for since about 2001 too. Cannabis has useful medicinal purposes. It's not a cure-all, and I think that's an important point. And it's not a fix for everybody's problems. And unfortunately, some of the advocates become very, and I understand why they're passionate, but sometimes they make claims that are not helpful. It
Right.
has been shown to help people with chronic pain, and it can alleviate chronic pain in some people. It can help people with cancer where they're having chemotherapy and they're getting nausea and vomiting. It's been shown to help some children with epilepsy, particularly forms that aren't responsive to other medications. It can help people with MS and with multiple sclerosis. But the thing about medicinal cannabis is that nobody has ever died from an overdose of cannabis. And, in the United States, I think in 2017, there were some 70,000 overdose deaths, largely associated with prescription opioids. And a lot of these are for chronic pain. So if we have an alternative, which is something that is not going to kill people and that can help, then that really is something that we should be looking at. And it's like all medications. Should only be used where the benefits outweigh the side effects. And if either A, people take it and it doesn't help, or B, they take it and it causes side effects, then like any other medication, it should be stopped. But I think the way it's treated in some jurisdictions is this fearful, terrible drug is quite wrong. It is a medication that can help people. And, in my opinion, those people who can be helped should be able to get reasonable access to it. And I think you're right, we are going in that direction around the world. Germany has legalised medicinal cannabis, the UK. I think Brazil is now going down this path. New Zealand is looking to go down that path. South Korea has become the first Southeast Asian country to legalise it. Look, I suspect within the next 10 to 15 years, we'll be back to where we were in the 1920s, before probably the 1930s, where medicinal cannabis was used. It's only since the mid-1930s that it was outlawed.
Right. Yeah, the number of opioid deaths here in America is just staggering. I mean, it's amazing how many people are addicted and how many people overdose. And I don't know much about it other than what I read on in the news and whatnot. But boy, it sure seems like anything that we could do to lessen the impact of opioid abuse in America would be. I mean, it would be huge. It would be huge. How does marijuana use? How does it lessen the need for opioids? How does it relieve pain? I've heard this claim from people before, but how would that work?
Look, the human body has what's called an endocannabinoid system, which was only discovered within about the last 15 years or so. So there are receptors for the body's own endocannabinoids. There's one called anandamide. There's a couple of others. We don't have to go into technicalities. And medicinal cannabis that's taken in, and most of the time medicinal cannabis is taken as an oral preparation. So you swallow it, you're not smoking it like a joint.
Well, that's interesting.
Some people do vape it, some people have oils, some people take it as drops under the tongue. It's like, for example, paracetamol, or there's a whole host of pain-killing medications that work on receptors within the body to lessen that pain. Now, what we find with medicinal cannabis is it probably has two effects. One is a direct analgesic or pain-killing effect. The other, and this is what the studies often tell us, is that it also can have a bit of a calming effect. So people say, yes, I'm aware that I still have some pain, but I don't feel quite as badly about it. So overall, it can improve people's quality of life. Weight for weight, it's not as strong a painkiller as opiates. Now, if you've just had a broken leg and you've been in hospital, then that's probably not the time when medicinal cannabis as a painkiller is going to be very helpful to you. That is the time when for the first, so many days, it's actually quite useful to have an opiate painkiller. But if you have chronic ongoing pain, then what you don't really want is to be on an addictive medication that has, unfortunately, a potential to kill you. So that is the role really for medicinal cannabis. At a cellular level, like all of these medications, it'll work on different receptors. And I really do want to stress that nothing works for everybody every time. So it's not saying that we should never use opiates. It's saying that we just really want more options, and we want to be, where we can, moving people away from, or at least reducing their dosages of opiate medications, which are far more dangerous than medicinal cannabis.
Is there any evidence of liver damage from marijuana?
Look, there hasn't been. One of the things that people are starting on medicinal cannabis, it's useful them to have baseline liver and kidney function tests. But the thing with any, and there are a lot of other medications that can affect the liver, and statins for cholesterol are very high on that list. So we always come back to, are the positive effects outweighing the negative effects? Now, in therapeutic doses, the chances of any liver abnormalities from medicinal cannabis, it's not zero, but it's extraordinarily low, and it can be monitored. And and I underline if it was a problem, then like with any other medication with unacceptable side effects, then you'd need to stop it. But no, alcohol is a much bigger issue for the liver than cannabis.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dr. Joe, I think we've kind of reached the end of our time. I really appreciate you coming on. How can my reader or listeners connect with you? Can they follow you on social media? How can they do all that?
Yeah, look, they go to my website, which is www.drjoe.net.au, and you kindly mentioned about the book, which is Dr. Joe's DIY Health, and you can get copies there. It's $20 Australian, which probably is about $13 US or something like that. And I also have a blog called drjoetoday.com. And probably the simplest thing is, if you go onto those sites, you can click the buttons for Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, where I do have a presence.
Okay, fantastic. We're going to put links to all of that in the show notes, and you guys can go to mysugarfreejourney.com/podcast to get that, to see that, all the links to his social media stuff and the books and whatnot. So, Dr. Joe, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
All right, fantastic. Those of you that are listening, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information. All right, hold on.